Hey, listeners, welcome to our podcast on navigating ethical dilemmas in child and youth care. So, in this first episode, we will be diving into boundaries in our work, a topic that is obviously essential for, maintaining trust and professionalism in our relationship with youth. We're going to be sharing real life experiences, discuss key ethical concerns, and explore how CYCs can maintain professional integrity while also building strong relationships with the young people that we work with. So, boundaries are the limits we set to define the professional relationship. So, these can be emotional, physical, or social boundaries, and they help, maintain a healthy dynamic between CYCs and the youth that we work with.
Yeah, and I think boundaries aren't just about protecting ourselves as CYCs, but it's also about creating a space where young people feel safe and they know what to expect from us. But if things become too loose, it can also make things like a lot more confusing for them.
Exactly. And I feel like some youth will naturally push boundaries, not necessarily because they're trying to be difficult, but because they're testing what's safe. So if we're not clear, it can make the relationship feel sort of unstable for them.
Yeah, like there are different types of boundaries, obviously, like physical, emotional, and social. Um, so for example, like physical boundaries, includes things like respecting personal space, while emotional boundaries involve not becoming, too emotionally involved in a way that might, compromise our ability to make clear decisions.
Yeah, and I feel like physical boundaries can be one of the hardest things to navigate because different settings have different rules. Some places allow CYCs to hug kids while others don't even allow side hugs or handshakes.
Yeah, that's so true. And like emotional boundaries are tough too because we build relationships with the youth, but like we also have to make sure we don't take their emotional burden in a way that affects our ability to do our job.
Yeah, and on top of that, there's also social boundaries, like what kind of interactions are like appropriate outside of work or even online. Like, are you adding young people on social media? Like, are you sharing personal stories with them? Like, those things can often really blur the line.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like as CYCs, we always have to ask ourselves, like, is this helping the youth or is this crossing a line? Because I feel like boundaries are there obviously to support them and not shut them out. And also, like, I feel like one of the biggest challenges in CYC work is balancing care and professionalism. We're constantly, told to build strong relationships with young people, but we also have to maintain professional boundaries. So I feel like the question is, how do we show care and connection while also still being professional?
That's such a real struggle, Sarah. I think a lot of CYCs feel like they're walking a fine line between being approachable and being too involved. And honestly, different placements can even have different ideas of what professionalism even means to them.
And I agree. And I feel like the definition of professionalism in our field is so broad. In some places, being warm and relational is expected, while in others, it's almost seen as a risk. Like if you care too much, it might be misinterpreted as overstepping. But how are we supposed to build trust without emotional connection?
Yeah, exactly. And like I feel like this ties into how we define care. I feel like care, it doesn't just mean being emotionally available, right? It also means like, being ethical, maintaining boundaries, and I guess making sure that we're supporting the youth in a way that's actually helpful for them in the long term.
Yeah, that's a good point. Care isn't just about, being nice or doing whatever makes the youth feel happy in the moment. It's about making sure they have the structure and consistency they need to feel safe. And sometimes that means making hard decisions, even if it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah, and that's where professionalism comes in. It's not about being cold or being distant. It's about making sure that our support is always intentional. Like if a young person is relying on us too much emotionally, we have to acknowledge when to step back and encourage them to build other support systems as well.
That's something I personally struggled with in one of my placements. There were some young people who would open up to me about really personal things, and I wanted to be there for them, but I also had to be mindful of not acting like their best friend. I had to sort of remind myself that support doesn't mean over involvement, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and like I feel like that's really important, and that's also where supervision comes in, right? So like if you're ever unsure, checking in with your supervisor is essential, and like
Hmm.
sometimes we don't realize, we're getting too emotionally invested until like, someone else shows us or like points.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Sorry. At the end of the day, like care professionalism, oh my God, professionalism are opposites. They do go hand in hand, and being professional means showing up consistently, setting healthy boundaries, and making sure our support are ethical and sustainable, not just for the youth, but for ourselves as well. We're also important.
Yeah, exactly. So like it's important for us to understand professionalism, and it doesn't mean like just shutting down emotional connection. It means creating a safe space, something, ethical and sustainable relationships as well. And as CYCs, I feel like we need to redefine professionalism in a way that centers relational care rather than restricting it.
Yeah, now let's dive into a case study that highlights how navigating boundaries can often get complicated, especially when you move between different work environments and placements. Boundaries aren't static, but what's acceptable in one space might not be acceptable in another. And as CYCs, we're often stuck in that gray area where we're trying to figure out what's okay while still balancing our relationship and prioritizing the relationship with the young person.
Exactly, Jamila. And that's actually something I personally experienced during my internship. So, at my first placement, the culture around physical affection was very open, especially if it was initiated by the young person themselves. Like, if a young person came up to me for a hug, I could easily return that affection without it being seen as crossing a line. And the staff really saw that kind of connection as a core part of relationship building. They believed that physical touch, when appropriate and led by the young person themselves, was a way to make them feel safe, valued, and emotionally supported, which I really agreed with at my core. But when I started my second placement, it was very different because the approach was complete opposite. And during my training, they actually told us that they don't engage in physical affection, even if the child or young person initiates it first. So if they came and hugged us, the expectation was to redirect them. And an example they gave was offering a high five or maybe a side hug, which was so different. And the reason they gave me was to quote unquote remain professionalism.
Yeah, that's a big difference. And I feel like in the moment that can like, be like feel really conflicting. And it's because, you're not really trying to reject the child, but it feels that way, especially if they're seeking comfort or connection. And I had a really similar experience as well, adding on to UFNAN. Like my first place
Mhm.
was also more relaxed when it came to like affection, especially with younger kids and like JK, SK. If they ran up for a hug, it wasn't really questioned. And honestly, it felt natural because at that age, kids express connection that way. But then my second placement was at a treatment center and it was with older kids, which is understandable because they were like grade 6 to 12 and the rules were like completely different. And even with the younger kids, they were really strict about no physical contact beyond maybe a high five. But I get why, like, different settings have these different boundaries. Like in treatment settings, maintaining, professionalism is seen as a way to protect both the staff and the youth. And I guess it really showed me like how much context matters when it comes to setting boundaries in our field.
Oh yeah, that I totally see that. It's interesting because different workplaces shape their boundaries based on the population they serve, right? And their organizational values. But sometimes I wonder if they consider how these rules impact the relationship building process. For example, if a kid already struggles with trust and they're reaching out for a hug, what message does it send when we step back or redirect them?
Yeah, and that's what made it like really hard for me because there were times when a child would come running toward me for a hug because they were excited, or maybe they had a rough morning. And instead of matching their energy and that connection, I felt like I had to pause and think, oh, like, what was the protocol again? Oh, yeah, like I have to give them a high five instead. It felt so awkward and really weird. Like I was placing this barrier between us, even when my like instincts were telling me to respond in a natural, caring way.
Mhm.
And what really stood out to me was the way the agency framed it to me. Like they said it was about professionalism, and I found it interesting and honestly kind of frustrating at the same time that they chose to use that word in that context. Because like, what about returning a hug from a child who trusts you makes you unprofessional, you know?
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like, I feel like the word professionalism gets thrown around a lot, and sometimes I wonder, like who actually defines what professional means in a care-based field like ours?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why is relational care, which is obviously like a key part of like what we do, seen as, less professional when it doesn't fit in, into like the clinical standards?
Yeah, and I agree, Sarah. But I also see how agencies are thinking about liability. Like they're worried about CYCs crossing the line or a child misunderstanding a situation or maybe what you said. But it does feel like these policies are shaped by more fear than what actually benefits the youth. Maybe like instead of these blanket rules, they should be focusing on training CYCs to navigate these situations with nuance, to
Mm-hmm.
understand the circumstances better.
Yeah, it really made me reflect on how different agencies hold different philosophies and how those philosophies are shaped by fear. And it's interesting that you brought that up because, like, it felt like it was about the liability and policy of it all. The first agency felt more community based and relationship focused, whereas the second one felt more risk averse and more about maintaining emotional distance, even though it didn't feel necessarily natural to me.
Yeah, and I feel like the more we move toward clinical models of care, the more emotional distance becomes normalized. But at the same time, we all know that trust and connection are the foundation of CYC work. So, how do we balance safety and ethics without losing what makes our work effective?
Yeah, and like I think that's a tension we constantly face in this field, right? So like, we're told to build meaningful relationships, but also to hold back, right? To connect and also, be cautious. I think a lot of CYCs are, navigating that invisible line of too much and not enough. And honestly, it can feel like you're, just set up to fail no matter what you do, so it could be difficult.
That's so true. And it's not just about physical boundaries, it's even about emotional ones too. Like when we're forced to suppress our relational instincts, it can make us feel sort of robotic, like we're just following rules instead of rather responding authentically. And that's especially tough when we know some kids rely on that emotional connection to feel supported and seen.
Exactly. So I think the more grounded question is how do we as CYCs work within the existing definitions of professionalism while still honoring and prioritizing relational care? Like we might not have the power to redefine like the agency policies that are already put in place as new CYCs, but we can still show up with warmth and empathy.
And that's what makes this work that we do so complex because we're often in situations where our instincts tell us to respond one way, but then the policy tells us something else. So the work becomes, as you said, figuring out how to stay present and relational within those limits because the boundaries are there for a reason, obviously, and we have to respect them, even though they might feel uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah.
So, we've talked a lot about the complexities of boundaries, how they shift in different settings, and how tricky it can be to balance connection with professionalism. So, what do you think are some key takeaways and best practices for setting and maintaining those boundaries within our work?
I feel like one of the first things I'd say is that setting clear expectations from the start is key. And, having open conversations with the youth and their families about what's acceptable in your space really helps, avoid misunderstandings. And I think it's about, getting on the same page from day one so that, everyone knows what's expected and, what's respected as well.
Exactly, and part of our growth as CYCs is learning how to adapt to the expectations of each setting. Like even if we can't change the policies, we can still find ways to still offer relational care that still aligns with the boundaries we were given. It's about being intentional, not disconnected.
Definitely. And to add on to Jamila, and it is when it comes to communicating those boundaries, it's important to approach it with care, you know? You want to show respect for the person while still maintaining those professional limits. So instead of being strict or distant with the youth, you can say something like, I understand you're going through a lot, but we need to stick to these boundaries so we can work together in a way that's both supportive and effective. That way they can still feel heard and understood.
Yeah, that's very important communication. But I'd also add when we're unsure about a situation, it's always a good idea to consult our agency's guidelines and reach out to our supervisors. Sometimes things could get a little challenging, so getting that extra support or a second opinion is very important. It's always better to double check and make sure we're on the right track, especially when it comes to trickier, sensitive situations, instead of just trying to figure it out on our own.
Yeah, I agree with Sean. And even when we're in a situation where we feel like boundaries can be unclear or they're hard to manage, we have to remember that they're there for a reason. Like, boundaries aren't just about shutting people down, it's about creating a safe space for both us as CYCs and also the youth. It also protects the relationship and it can ensure that we are still supporting the young person without overstepping.
Exactly, I agree. Whether it's about, setting clear expectations, communicating with care, or seeking guidance when needed, these practices can help us navigate those gray areas with confidence. And boundaries are essential in making sure our relationships with youth are healthy, respectful, and sustainable. In keeping those lines open will essentially make us better at what we do in the future.
Yeah, this was such an important conversation, I feel. It really showed us, like how boundaries aren't just about rules. They're about navigating complex emotions, agency culture, and our own instincts as relational practitioners.
It really did, Sarah, and we hope it gave the audience something to reflect on. And we're also excited to keep the conversation going moving forward. So thank you for tuning in. Next episode, we'll talk about mandatory reporting and confidentiality. See you then, and don't forget to check our bio for resources and a link to our Instagram for updates.